They say the past is another country. Life was different then. In rural Ontario, a man went to work in the morning, expecting his wife and child to be safe and sound when he came home. Chaos was something that happened in other people's lives, somewhere else. But on this early spring day, one family's life and a whole community's sense of safety were shattered forever. In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours. Gormley, Ontario, 1970. Local police respond to an emergency call. Retired Police Chief Don Hillock still remembers, even though it was over 30 years ago.
When I arrived, I found a husband at home, very distraught, very upset, and inside the house was his wife in a pool of blood. It was a night table that had quite a sharp corner on it, and the doctor assumed that maybe she might have fallen against it and split the back of her head open.
The body of Kathleen Philcox is taken to the morgue for autopsy to establish cause of death. Detective Hillock consoles the husband, Lester, and asks him to describe what he saw when he came home. It was strange, he says, that the front door was locked. Like most people in the area, he and his wife never locked the door. Then he noticed that the phone was off the hook in the kitchen. Down the hall in the bedroom, he made the terrible discovery. Detective Hillock is a cop in a small town where violent crime is extremely rare. He's never seen anything like this before. And yet, he's thinking this may not have been an accident.
I had a feeling that it was foul play. That's what I thought.
Next morning, the autopsy confirms the detective's suspicions. Kathleen Philcox had been raped and shot to death. The pathologist recovers 7 .22 caliber bullets, 2 from her back, 5 from her head. For the detective, the fact that 7 bullets had been fired is significant. Most revolvers hold only 6 bullets.
I don't think anybody in those circumstances would reload. So right away it makes me think that it was a 9-shot revolver.
Hillock hopes his assumption will help them zero in on a suspect. A 9-shot .22 is a very unusual weapon. Later the same day, Don Hillock returns to the Philcox house. Investigators scour the bedroom for clues, dusting for fingerprints, collecting blood, fibers, and hairs.
You're saying that you came home...
Detective Hillock needs more information from Lester Philcox. He claims he left his wife at home at 8 a.m. and was at school all day teaching. His story checks out. Police need to broaden their investigation.
Right at the very beginning, we had to check out neighbors, friends, associates of the family. It was difficult. We had to prove where they were and alibi them.
Police question everyone in the community and ask men in the area for a blood sample. Their samples will be compared to the attacker's blood type. In 1970, DNA testing has not yet been invented. Labs use what is known as the ABO blood typing system. A simple method, which can't positively identify the killer, just narrow down the potential suspects. The semen sample from the victim shows the attacker has type A blood. Days into the investigation, Hillock and his partner are still combing through the community. But many area residents are so shaken up by the murder, they're not making it easy.
They wouldn't come to the door if you were in plain clothes. What we did was talk to people through an upstairs window, most times. Your home is invaded, and to be shot that many times in a rural area, it was just hardly believable. A lot of people started going out and getting guns, learning how to shoot guns. People were just scared. "13 days after Kathleen Philcock's murder, police still have no serious suspects. Then, police get a call from a frightened young boy. He's found his mother on the floor. She's not breathing, and a strange man has just run out of their house. A second murder. This time, the Ontario Provincial Police take the case. OPP detective Don McNeil speaks with 8-year-old Ben Rickman. Ben tells the detective what he remembers. He was in his room playing when his mother answered the door.
His mother came into the room and advised him that there was a gentleman there that had a sick child in the car, required to use the phone. Later on, he heard what he thought to be fireworks go off in the house, and he went and he found his mother lying on the floor.
Ben saw blood on the back of her shirt, but didn't understand what had happened. That's when he heard someone behind him. The man looked him straight in the eyes. Elaine Rickman is pronounced dead at the scene and taken to the morgue. The autopsy reveals that she was killed by 3 bullets, 2 in her head and 1 in her back. Elaine Rickman had also been raped. Biologists determined from the semen that the killer was a blood type A. And forensic analysis of the 3 bullets show that they were fired from the same .22 caliber gun that killed Kathleen Philcock. Police now have a clear link between the 2 murders. Detective McNeil has to consider a disturbing hypothesis.
Some people were thinking, well, is this our first Ontario serial killer?
If it is a serial killer, will police be able to catch him before he strikes again? Two women have been brutally raped and murdered. Ontario police fear they're dealing with their first serial killer. Detective McNeil returns to the Rickman house with the police artist. The victim's son, Ben, describes the man he saw. But the vicious attack has had a chilling effect on Ben's father. Ben has looked into the eyes of his mother's killer, and his father is afraid he's no longer safe at home. His father sends Ben to stay with relatives. Meanwhile, the Ontario Provincial Police set up a task force and launched the biggest manhunt the province has ever seen.
As a result of the bulletin that was published and was printed in the newspapers, there was a minimum of 5,000 leads that came in that had to be checked out.
While the task force follows up each lead, McNeil tries to find a common link between the 2 murder victims.
Both victims were nurses. Had they worked at the same hospital, had they gone to training together, and we could not find any common denominator where both women knew each other. Both husbands were school teachers, and the same thing again. There was no known contact between either family.
Despite the uncanny similarities in the 2 families' lives, police are unable to make any direct connection between them that can help in their manhunt. Weeks drag into months. Tips from the public dry up, and the investigation slows down. After a year, the task force is disbanded, but the case stays open. 3 years after the murders, out of the blue, there's a break in the case. McNeil gets an anonymous call telling police to check out a man named Scott Wilson. Apparently, Wilson confessed to a friend that he was involved in something terrible around the time of the murders.
A gentleman came to light who had been acting strangely, and as a result of acting strangely, ended up in a mental institution.
With Scott Wilson away in an institution, police take a trip out to his property, just down the road from where one of the murders occurred. They find no one around, but the door to the shed is open. Inside, they find a child's coffin, clearly handmade. They also find a collection of guns, including a 7.7 millimeter rifle. Not the .22 caliber 9-shot they're looking for, but evidence that the man has a taste for unusual guns. Detective McNeil visits Wilson in the psychiatric hospital. He has a mental disorder caused by years of excessive drinking. He's reported to have always been an angry, violent drunk. When McNeil interviews Wilson, nothing he says is coherent. It's frustrating. But McNeil does get Wilson to give a saliva sample for blood typing. Police also take a hair sample, hoping to match it to a hair found at the crime scene. The results come back from the saliva. Wilson is blood type A, the same as the killer. Police also discover that he was not at work on the days of either murder. And in the time he's been in the psychiatric hospital, there have been no other murders in the area. With the evidence they've collected, police think they could win a conviction. But there's a problem. Scott Wilson is unfit to stand trial. So even though the case officially remains open, police believe they've found their killer and stop further investigation. But in fact, it will take McNeil more than 20 years to close this case. 20 years during which forensic technology is revolutionized with the advent of DNA testing. 20 years during which Don McNeil rises through the ranks of the OPP. In 1995, he's put in charge of cold cases.
At that particular time, one of the relatives had written a letter and wanted to know what the status was in regard to the investigation. And so I volunteered for it because I knew a lot of the details of the case.
McNeil's prime suspect over 20 years ago, Scott Wilson, is long dead from brain cancer. At that time, he couldn't absolutely prove that Wilson was the killer. Now, with DNA testing, he thinks he can finally close the case. McNeil sends the hair and saliva samples they took from Wilson to the lab. Here, biologists will try to compare Wilson's DNA to the DNA obtained from the murderer's semen sample.
One of the issues whenever you're dealing with old cases like these is how the evidence has been preserved, or in fact, if it's been preserved. In this case, the items were preserved and were preserved properly, and that allowed us to go back and do the DNA work in this case.
2 weeks later, McNeil gets a call.
Kim Johnson from the Center for Forensic Science phoned and burst our bubble by saying, "Not even close."
McNeil's whole case goes into a tailspin. But sometimes Lady Luck is a detective's best friend. Just when he thinks his case has gone dead cold, McNeil is handed a gift that could throw the case wide open. "25 years after 2 unsolved rape murders, Detective Don McNeil has an intriguing new lead to pursue. A piece of evidence he happens to notice in a case file of a convicted armed robber named Ron West. Shortly after he was arrested, West's house was sold. When the new owners were renovating, they discovered jewelry boxes hidden in a ceiling, along with a gun registration for a 9-shot .22 caliber handgun. But records show the gun had been sold by West in 1972. McNeil considers why West would want to keep an expired gun registration.
I thought to myself that this could be considered maybe a trophy, because the jewelry boxes were a trophy of the armed robberies that he had committed and he had pleaded guilty to.
McNeil needs to find out more about Ron West. He's currently serving an 8-year sentence for his violent armed robberies. At the time of the 2 murders in 1970, West was a police constable in Toronto's 53 Division. McNeil also discovers that Ron West would have been familiar with the area of the murders. He grew up there. McNeil officially reopens the case and assigns a team to investigate this new suspect. One of the key officers is Detective John Smith.
Since Mr. West worked for the Metro Toronto Police Service in May of 1970, we had to go back and interview every single police officer that worked at 53 Division in Metro Toronto Police at that time.
Most of the former policemen Detective Smith interviews have little memory of West, but one of them remembers West well.
He wasn't loud, he wasn't quiet. He enjoyed a good joke and telling a good joke, and it was just through one of the guys in the platoon that I sort of struck up a friendship with.
Ron West and Keith Rogers frequently spent their days off together. Rogers remembers a particular day in 1970, a few months after the murders. They were at West's family farm taking some informal target practice. That day stands out in Rogers' memory because West was using a 9-shot pistol.
I'd never seen this 9-shot 22 revolver. I always thought there was a 6-shooter, so I was surprised to see that, and I used that a fair bit to shoot at these pumpkins. To hear, 30 years later that he's now, a suspect in a double homicide it was a little shocked. Wow.
Because he and West were in the same platoon in 1970, they worked the same shifts and took the same days off. Luckily, Rogers still has his memo book from those days.
I had a memo book, the second memo book I'd ever written, and I kept it. And when you worked backwards from that memo book, on the days, 2 of these murders, my memo book put him off duty.
It's all beginning to add up for McNeil. The 9-shot gun, the days off, West's association with the area, and his record of violence. But McNeil still needs physical proof. He goes to visit West in prison. If West agrees to provide a sample of his DNA, it can be compared to the killer's DNA at the lab. West is within his rights to refuse, and he does. McNeil decides to confront West with what the police know about the murders, hoping he'll confess. McNeil tells West they know he went to the home of Kathleen Philcox on May 6, 1970, raped her at gunpoint, and then shot her 7 times in the back. McNeil says they also know that West raped and shot the second victim, Elaine Rickman, 13 days later. West is an ex-cop. He knows if police had enough to charge him, they wouldn't be angling for his confession. He says nothing. After all these years, McNeil feels he's within striking distance of the killer, but he's still coming up short. Then, another stroke of luck. Police in Ron West's hometown send Detective McNeil a letter they received from West's ex-wife.
This letter had been mailed to her from the jail, and she did not want to have anything to do with him or the letter, and she turned it over to the police.
McNeil hopes it will contain some incriminating statements, but West is too smart for that. Then McNeil realizes what he may have in his hand.
When someone licks a stamp or an envelope flap, generally because it's sticky, they leave their cells and therefore DNA behind. We can then extract the DNA and then compare it to any other samples we have. In this case, the DNA profile obtained from the stamp matched the DNA profile we had from semen in both cases.
With the evidence mounting against him, just 5 days before his trial, West pleads guilty to both murder charges. It's been 30 years since the double homicide investigation began. Finally, police and the families of the victims can close the door on the horrific events of May 1970. In court, victim impact statements of the children of West's victims are read to the sentencing judge. The full traumatic effects of the murders on the children are revealed. Plagued by nightmares, destroyed relationships, and unable to trust anyone, the two boys have spent a lifetime in fear. As Detective Smith transports Ron West back to the jail after his guilty plea, he asks a question that has troubled him.
I asked him why he did not shoot the son in both homicides. His response to me was, "Who kills kids?" And my response to him was, "Who kills the mother of an 8-year-old boy or an 18-month-old son and leaves them motherless for the rest of their lives?" To which he had no response.
Ron West is sentenced to 2 life terms, 1 for each murder. The stories on 72 Hours are true. The detectives and forensic scientists are the ones who actually worked on the case. The names of the victims are fictitious. The names of the convicted are real.